This is going to be a bit of an experiment. When I originally had the idea for presenting Patrick Lecture 182, the process of meditation, I got the idea that I'd rather show you than tell you about it. And so I asked some of the regular meeting attendees if they would like to do a very brief process before or after the meetings for a week or so to see if we would find a process that could be viewed by others and give the impression, communicate the process. And 5 people volunteered, and all 5 videos worked out really well. I truncated them so that they were as concise as possible, meaning I took out some of the little bit of introduction, sometimes a little bit of the ending, so that they were concise and they contained the actual process of the person working. To me, this is a magical and sacred process. It's a sacred space. When I am working with someone and inviting their positive, universal, divine self forward, inviting the ego to make room for a deeper part of them, a knowing they already have, but have lost or become disassociated from. It's private, and so not meant for other people to watch. And it's hard for people to understand. But by making these little tiny demo segments, and the person knowing they were going to go on YouTube and they were going to be demo segments and having a finite time to work in, we were able to capture a simple piece of process. I feel that these are good examples of what is done in a pathwork process group, in meeting processes, in classes. The joke is everything is process. It's a matter of the level of depth or amount of feeling that's involved, but that this work is never an intellectual exercise. It's not a question and answer process. So here's what I'm going to do in this video. I'm going to outline the process of the meditation, and then I'm going to describe a bit from the lecture. And then as part of this little playlist, I'm going to add the 5 videos. One of them is 2 parts, so there's actually 6 pieces. And I don't want to introduce or comment upon the process. I think they speak for themselves. The one part that's in 2 pieces are because we had audio problems when the real self was being spoken. The volume got lower and lower and lower until I couldn't hear it. So I interrupted and then we chatted. And when we were chatting, the voice came right back up. The ego was very firm and confident. And so I added part of that segment so that you can hear the regular ego voice. But this would be an example of going to the real self and just feeling it's a little murky and not quite sure, and you become hesitant and not certain, versus your ego self, your personality self, might have a lot of confidence in the majority of work that you do. So feeling the differences between these aspects of yourself is this process of meditation. The pathwork meditation processes are all active. They're not just sitting and being quiet. It's sitting and being quiet and noticing. So it's an invitation process to stop the mind from being busy and to allow other thoughts and processes to rise to the surface that are usually outshouted by the personality, the ego, the emotions, etc., the intellect. So the pathwork meditation process is quite active. This particular one is called Meditation for 3 Chairs, just to emphasize, number one, how it's done in workshops. It's done by sitting or being or leaning or holding, three different representations of different kinds of energy, so that we can bring it out of the abstract and have a clearer sense of it. So that when I speak to you from this place and I acknowledge that this is my ego speaking, then if I spoke from my real self, I might be sitting in a different position and I would be focusing on a different energy versus my kid energy, which does come out during these recordings. Um, it has a lot of fun and a lot of joy and gets very bouncy and loud. Um, that I can access that, but it's better to access it from a different position. And then when I hear the ego coming back in, you change position and say, okay, let's let the ego speak from its chair. So that's the idea. It's called three chairs because you need to access three energies. Or, and this is the tricky part, you got to access two to get started. The third is optional. What I found in the videos that are attached to this playlist is that a lot of the problem is differentiating the positive intent aspect of ego from the real self. A lot of people have not clearly identified their inner divine energy. They confuse it with their positive intent from the personality level, from the ego level. So that when we go into differentiate, it's tricky to differentiate, using the word differentiate a lot, these two energies. The important part of that is that the ego dominates a lot of your conversation with yourself. And so to get the support of the deeper divine aspect of you, it's important to be able to discern that voice, make sure it's fully present and listened to, heard, not obeyed, simply heard. And when the ego is speaking all the time, it does have an agenda. The ego has a purpose on the earth plane. Its job is to take care of things, to make decisions, to observe, to take care of all the needs being met. Whereas the divine is calmer, quieter, more confident. One of the ways you can tell the difference between the ego and the divine is that the divine doesn't have an agenda. It is confident that what it's trying to do is being done. Now, I run into this a lot with different lectures. People say, well, I'm not sure that I'm performing my incarnatory task. And I use my kid voice in this. You can't avoid your incarnatory task. Your spirit is bigger than you are. It's stronger than you are. So the ego thinks it's in an arm wrestling match with spirit and that it could win. That's a misunderstanding of the divine. You're not going to win in an arm wrestling match against spirit. It's going to win. But it's going to win by not trying to beat you. It's going to win by simply being positive, by simply inviting, by caring and loving, and relying on the growth of your positive intent over decades, lifetimes, to become more present. So that when I listen to the different voices, as you'll hear in the recordings, when I detect a wanting or an urging, I know that that's the ego, even if it's a different aspect of ego. We can splinter this into dozens of portions. The important thing is not what part is speaking necessarily, but to understand that aspects of the ego are not the inner divine. And then if we can, to act or to address the inner child, which may be immature and actually having a lot more impact on your life than you are consciously aware of. So the ego just is weak or undeveloped or uncertain, and the kid roars ahead. In one of the egos, we did get to those third voices. We did 3, 4, 5 voices. And it's interesting to hear, and it's the hearing of it that I encourage you to do rather than have me talk about it. So Patrick meditation process is quite active. Fundamental layers of personality. We have the conscious ego, the divine. You could call this, in the lecture, it's called the supraconscious divine self. I differentiate between higher self or divine consciousness and real self. Real self is outlined in the lectures. Real self is uniquely you. Other spiritual beings do not share your real self. That's your plan, your piece of the puzzle, your uh, facet in the universal plan. However, it's not different from the universal divine. It's just your piece. So either one of those, accessing the universal energy, accessing your divine real self, either will work. There is a slight difference if you wish to explore those over time. So conscious ego, the supraconscious universal self or real self, and the unconscious egotistical child level. Now, by egotistical child level, I'm going to explain that a bit, which the guy does in other lectures, so that it's hard to read one lecture because it'll use certain words and you go off with a certain impression of that. And there's 15 other lectures that talk about it in different ways. So it's a little bit like the story of uh, 6 blind wise men going to see what an elephant is. And each one of them puts their hands on a part of the elephant, the tail, the trunk, the legs, the side, and they get a different impression of the elephant. Like a lot of things that you have already studied, you have realized that after a while you get a sense of a fuller context of the material, of the overall point of view. The words begin to be larger. You understand how everything fits together. The same thing happens with Patrick lectures. So in terms of unconscious egotistical child level, we're talking about a part of the energy of you that just wants what it wants and doesn't want to listen to any negativity, negativity, meaning any controls, any authority figure that gets in its way is considered negative. That this acting out, especially if you've tried to repress it, that's what makes it unconscious. That this unconscious, immature aspect of you may be influencing your life more than you realize because you've never sat down and heard it specifically blends in with a lot of other aspects of you. So these are the 3 fundamental layers of personality. Now, like voice dialogue, you can address different voices. And in one meeting, one of these segments, we did address various voices. But the important part is to have access to your divine, so you've got a true positive intent versus the ego and the ego's potential agenda before you address another voice. So before you go to 3 chairs, you need to get the 2 lined up. The importance of the ego, you can't minimize the importance of the ego. The ego controls the tongue. The ego controls what is spoken. If the ego doesn't want to cooperate, it has various ways of protesting and withholding and slipping its agenda in. So the interaction of the ego has to be threefold. The ego must initially want and commit itself to this process. This is not something you ask someone else to do. All of this work is voluntary. If it's not voluntary, it's not going to work. It requests it requests a certain level of dedication that can't be faked. So the ego must initially want it and commit itself to it. It must also ask for help of the universal self. It must be willing to access the universal self. So this is not psychology. This is spiritual work. And the third is that it must reach in to let out the negative side. It has to be willing to see the part that's perhaps not in the best of shape, that may be influencing in a way that could even be startling once you find it. Now, once we go to reaching in and letting out the negative side, then the ego is going to be leading in 3 different phases. It's kind of involved, this lecture. Phase 1 is recognition of the unconscious destructive egotistical self. So if we've got the 2 identified, which can take 20 minutes to a half an hour. Most of the recorded segments are only about the ego and the real self because it takes a little doing to untangle those two. Once you've done that, then you go on to look at a third voice. So the recognition of the unconscious, destructive, egotistical self. Phase 2 is following through the underlying misconceptions, the causes and effects, the meaning, and the price to be paid in regard to the present destructive attitudes. Meaning, after you see this, and part of the seeing is that it's hard to do this exercise by yourself. You can record it, but it's going to be important for you to hear the energy shift so that you can identify whether you got somewhere or not. While you're in it, you may think you're in real self, higher self. You may think you're in kid when you're actually in a more critical adult ego aspect. And that's why facilitation is important, at least at first on this. And once you get it, you'll be able to tell the difference. So it happens very quickly, the ability to identify. It is my experience that when I work with people on this, I usually only have to work with them 2 or 3 times and they got it. Once you get it, once you get the information, then you need to follow through. Need to find out why there's such rebellion against authority, why there is such a deep feeling of being needy or needs not being met. Why is there such a tremendous fear of abandonment? It can take 6 months to a year. It can take years to fully follow through on this. And you do it in passes. You do one, you take a look. Your life improves after every pass of this material. And then when you go back, you find there's more to do. So phase 2 is following through. Phase 3 is reorientation or re-education of the destructive part of the self. Once again, time consuming. This is not an easy process. It is a rewarding process and it works. My kid loves this because it's playful and it's fascinating. And there it is, that's what's going on. And then the work that the adult has to do is to deal with it and figure out where this came from. The last aspect of this is developing complementary attitudes, which are involvement versus detachment, going back and forth with being involved and invested and detached, not negatively detached, not dissociated, but unattached so that you can see what's going on, to engage and disengage, to involve and then detach. Another aspect of complementary attitudes is desire and desirelessness. That usually just befuddles people. I don't know what you're talking about. When you desire something, you're invested and you wind up with an agenda. So it's important to be able to step back from desire and release desire. Desirelessness is not a rejection of desire. It's not an embracing of desire. Think of it this way. If you want something to realign, you can't keep your hands on it. You need to let go and let it adjust, and then you can put your hands on it again. This is an ongoing process with all of these. You can possibly hear it. And the third is a complementary attitude of active versus passive inner attitude. Now, we study this in pathwork because this is the basis of the feminine and masculine energy systems, not male, female, that's different. But masculine energy versus feminine energy comes into active versus passive, not negative passive of I don't care, do whatever. The passive meant here is of waiting, allowing. So you do, you allow. You do, you observe. You do, you observe. It's second by second, millisecond by millisecond, back and forth. And the same with involvement and detachment and desire and desirelessness. So just to go over this, you've got three fundamental layers of personality. You've got work that the ego has to do to get ready and to do the task. There needs to be a reorientation and a re-education of the destructive part of the self. And then there needs to be a development of complementary attitudes. In the worksheet for this process, I included some additional information from the 50-50 work by Moira and Bert Shaw. I also included a PowerPoint presentation that I made a while back. It's simple, but cartoons are nice sometimes. It's good to see abstract, complex concepts made simple about how what investment means, seeing things from your perspective. I love using cartoons. I use film shorts, for instance, because they're very brief and they're very illustrative of certain ideas. So I even included a whole bunch of film ideas with YouTube Zoom links for illustrations of all these concepts. And the idea is wanted to bring it off the page, because this lecture, perhaps more than any other, is about a process, even far more than a technical understanding. The process is much faster than the technical understanding is. So that's all the preparation. And the videos will follow in the playlist. I hope you find them of interest. Thanks for watching. And my goal is for you to study the lectures or take a look at the lectures. They are online at pathwork.org, and all my study guides are online at janrigsby.org. And thanks for listening.